Okay, can anybody tell me if that appeared to have flipped the recording indication on?
It's recording.
Okay, great. So just as a reminder, this meeting is public and recorded, and the recordings will be posted to YouTube. If you don't like that, your option is to drop. With that, let's move on to today's agenda. By the way, I posted the link to that agenda in the chat, and please add your name to the attendees list. We'll start with community updates. The major update is we had submitted a PR with a charter for this SIG. It went through quite a cycle of reviews, but it is now here under our the Kubernetes community. So this is the code of conduct and rules, if you will, for how this SIG operates. Other than that, we've got preparation in place for a couple of SIG-sponsored sessions at KubeCon in Shanghai. There'll be an intro session and a deep dive. As we get closer, I'll post more details on that. That's it for community updates. Let's move on to active projects. So we've got 4 of them here that Andrew Kutz is going to talk about, the cloud providers.
No, I'm going to talk about 3 of them, the cluster APIs. I think Loke must be adding that.
Okay. Okay. Go ahead and talk about your 3. And Loke, could you put your name there after you on that section? Thanks. Go ahead.
Or just create a new section, because really all this other stuff came out of the cloud provider. Yeah. I should have probably changed that.
I can leave this on the screen, Andrew, or you can take over.
Oh, yeah, please just leave it on the screen. That's easy enough for me. So, yes, we had the SIG cloud provider meeting yesterday. Our fearless leader, Fabio, is on PTO, so he did not join us, but that does not stop the post nor community SIGs for Kubernetes. So as a minor update from what's going on there, again, this is all under the aegis of the cloud provider, the out-of-tree cloud provider. The conformance testing is really the last phase before an alpha release. Myself and Hui at VMware are working on that. And we should have tests uploading to test grid by the end of this week or beginning of next. Also zone support. Doug is on the line, so if he wants to add anything to this, I may. But it sounds like phase 1 using govmami tags is complete with phase 2 underway. It's kind of slowed down a little bit because I know Doug is trying to figure out how to keep. I'm getting an echo. I don't know if anyone else is.
Yeah, if people can mute, that's usually the explanation.
Really frustrating. Oh. Thank you. Okay, yeah, that went away. But phase 2 is underway, and like I said, I think Doug's trying to figure out how to prevent each node, each worker node or minion, as I see it now called, from having to have vSphere credentials. I think the idea is that they should be stored in some type of secure secrets or config map that can be accessed as needed. And then Travis Roden from VMware yesterday during the cloud provider gave an update on CSI. He said that Andrew? The office. Yes.
I'm sorry, I just have something to say to the zone support before you move on to CSI.
Please.
Yeah, maybe we can just reword the phases, because in that original issue describing the zone support, we're also talking about phase 1, phase 2, where phase 1 is the kind of basic tagging implementation and phase 2 is for stretch clusters. So it could confuse the reader depending on like kind of where you're reading from. I know what you want to say there, but maybe
actually, I'm happy to change it. I pulled this out of the, I'm getting up the link now. I pulled this out of the cloud provider notes from yesterday, and I believe maybe even Doug, do you want to speak to that? I mean, maybe were you the one that added that? Because this is in the cloud providers meeting notes from yesterday, and I literally just almost copied it. So I agree with you. Maybe I mistranslated what phase 2 is, because phase 1, as it's written here, sounds like what you said. Phase 2 is not.
Exactly. Yes.
Doug, is the phase 2 here supposed to be this?
So no, I hadn't added those notes yesterday. I did just post a link to the external cloud provider that gives the current summary.
Oh, you know what? So what it actually says in the phase 2 and the original cloud provider notes was arbitrary tagging. And I omitted that and just mentioned what was slowing it down. But in the original meeting notes, it looks like arbitrary tagging at any level on the hierarchy, vCenter, data center, et cetera.
Yeah.
Is that more in line with what you thought, Michael?
Yeah.
No,
No?
no,
Okay.
no. So basically, the phase 2 as there is kind of also the phase 1 that we described in the original issue. So maybe if you just remove the phase 1, phase 2 of that bullets and just leave in the.
I'm good. Tell you what, I'm going to leave it for now and can someone make a comment and then assign it to actually Doug? Because it should also then be fixed in the cloud provider notes, and I don't have enough information to change it myself. So I'd rather leave it until Doug and somebody else involved in it can figure out what the correct phrasing is. Maybe they can even reach out to you on Slack or something.
Sure.
Yeah, but thank you for mentioning that.
Thanks.
But
Yeah.
it should be fixed in both locations, I think.
Sure. Yes. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. And so moving on, CSI.
Well, wait,
Travis?
and one thing I want to point out, just in case people aren't aware, is that zone support, or correct me if I'm wrong, it's going into both the in-tree and the out-of-tree. It isn't only new work, correct?
Yeah, so it's currently in tree, and then the link I posted to chat is for the issue porting it to out of tree. And I gave that summary of the current updates because they will apply to both. And the issue that Andrew mentioned with in-tree currently requires credentials in the node config. I mentioned in that issue, it'll actually be solved in the out-of-tree implementation just by the cloud controller interface itself, the way that actually calls that method. Because in tree, there's no host or node context. It's just, give me the current zones for where you're running. But out of tree, the method actually has a parameter for the node ID. So cloud controller can look up all the tags for all nodes, but keeping the vSphere credential configuration just to that one place, to the cloud controller manager, not the nodes. Make sense?
Yep.
Is it okay if I finish out with CSI now?
Yeah, go ahead.
All right, great. So Travis Roden on the call yesterday mentioned that the Alpha CSI implementation will not be available with the Alpha cloud provider. I really don't want to put words in anyone's mouths here. Doug, I think you're involved in this a little bit as well. I think the plan is to still have some type of implementation alpha beta by KubeCon, not GA, but something, or is this just the alpha to alpha?
Yeah, we're targeting 113 for the alpha CSI for the.
Okay, we are. Okay. All right, and then I know they are also focusing on a first-class disk or FSD API to implement the new CSI provider. The current one, there is one out there, but it's not officially VMware's, but it sort of relies on what their Docker plugin does, a special service on each ESX host. And so they're going to be targeting, it looks like, the FCD API, which does require vSphere 6.5. So I think they were trying to solicit feedback to see if anyone thinks that would be an issue. And it will require adding support to Go vMommy for FCD. So Doug will be really busy. And anyone else who wants to help.
Yeah, for that specific item, there is the generated code is already there, and the kind of higher level idiomatic Go APIs are. I have a branch that had started on that like last November, before I was even involved with all this stuff directly. So there's some there, but yeah, there's still some work to do, especially to add support for simulator for testing.
And that's all I have.
Okay. if Loke, if you're ready, go ahead.
Okay.
Actually, I lied. I have really one more thing. I'm sorry. It came up in a conversation yesterday. I just want everyone to know going forward, you'll start to see words coming out of testing conversations, cloud provider, cluster provider. When you start to see things appear on the test grid related to VMware, anything that is just vSphere or VMware without anything else beside it refers to entry everything. That's the decision we kind of came to with it with SIG testing. We're not going to differentiate VMware storage provider and VMware cloud provider entry. It's vSphere or VMware, because nothing new will ever be added there in terms of actual providers, maybe patches or updates. But out of tree, you might see something like conformant stash cloud provider vSphere, cluster provider vSphere. But if it's just conformant stash vSphere, that means all things related to VMware entry. And the reason I thought about that was the organization here. The zones is a sibling to the cloud provider. It should probably be under it. But zone support as it relates to entry would just get categorized as vSphere once you start to see testing results appear on the test grid. So that's it. Sorry, Luke.
Oh, no problem. Okay, so I'm gonna give a status on what VMware is working on, and then I'll give you guys a heads up on some of the big things that the community is pulling in forward on the main repo. So right now we're working on better design documentation to add to the repo right now, and also better instructions on how to use the cluster control CLI. We're also trying to fix the cluster control delete cluster using the existing Terraform deployer. We're doing this so that when we start adding tests for vCSIM, we can be assured that this operation actually works, so that when we move to, which leads on to the next one, we're moving from Terraform to GoVMami, and we're continuing that process. So back to the second issue, why we had to fix delete cluster first. Well, when we moved to vCSIM for testing, in order to make sure that the GoVMami transition worked successfully, we got to make sure that the Terraform path also worked. And right now it has basically a 20-minute loop that polls for about 20 minutes or so after it had finished the deleting of the cluster. Okay, so three big things that are coming down the pipeline from the community. The community is moving away from API Builder and moving to Kube Builder. So there's a big CRD transition right now. Eventually, that is going to affect the vSphere provider. As a first pass, they're not finished with the CRD transition yet, but as a first pass, they are going to use the GCE provider as a guinea pig and try to come up with best practices for all the other vendor providers. They're also adding this concept of machine class that's kind of patterned after storage class. And last but not least, they are looking at adding the cluster autoscaler to the cluster API at some point. And that is all I have.
Okay, let's move farther on the agenda. Michael, are you ready to talk about the update on the vSphere cloud provider and persistent storage?
Yes, so this is basically just a heads up, and this is talking about the in-tree cloud provider. So I think eventually we'll figure out with the out-of-tree, but right now we have a deployment challenge, let's put it that way, for Kubernetes environment that are deployed across separate vSphere clusters where there's no shared storage between the vSphere clusters. And you want to leverage dynamic volume provisioning, which would fail just based on how the vSphere cloud provider is kind of deploying and creating volumes. So I opened this issue and made a suggestion on how to fix it, also based on the zone tagging support that we implemented for the zone support. And I'm trying to figure out finding an engineer to get this worked on. Basically, in this call, I just wanted to highlight that we are aware of that and we align it with the out-of-tree cloud provider developments.
Okay, and you had a question in the agenda for attendees, an ask about recommendations for spinning up Kubernetes on vSphere?
Yeah, so and maybe that's just a great hook for Andrew.
That's what I was actually going to give a demo of.
Great. So I'll give you my perspective on that, Andrew. And I looked into Yakety, so I checked the repo out, and it looks like it could be useful for me. So due to the work on the zones and stuff like that, there's a need to spin up a lot of Kubernetes clusters quickly on a vSphere environment. And so I was just looking for an easy way, and maybe it's what you were talking about. So I just give it to you now.
Sure. So, Steve, is it okay if I talk a little bit about this?
Yeah, go right ahead. And did you want to take over sharing? You can.
Yeah, I'll go ahead and share my screen at this point. Let's see, share. Gotta wait until you stop.
Okay, just a minute.
No problem.
Okay, I'm stopped.
All right. So let me find those notes. Okay, so that's CSI plugin. Okay, here we go. Time permitting, Andrew. Okay, yeah. So with at VMware and myself, we've been working on testing for the in-tree and out-of-tree cloud providers. He's been working on the out-of-tree, and I know he's talked about it a bit on this call before. I finally got the in-tree all together, but in doing that, I ended up creating two things that I think could be useful for other people. So first of all, at first I was standing up Kubernetes clusters using purely Terraform. Terraform was responsible for standing up both the infrastructure, so the virtual machines, the networking, as well as installing the Kubernetes software. And notice I don't say bootstrapping because there is no kubelet on the control plane nodes. It's really more installing. But one thing I realized as I was doing it was that there was no great way to support certificates with both host names and IP addresses once you came into a dynamic network, a DHCP-enabled network. It worked great when I was deploying a statically addressed Kubernetes cluster, but not so much when using DHCP, because you don't know any of that ahead of time. So initially what it ended up doing was using a combination of Terraform and some scripting. And I would write out files that had placeholders, and then I had other services that would rewrite those. Eventually got to the point where it was too complicated and hard to keep up. So I just realized, hey, why don't I just script the whole thing, at least from Kubernetes perspective. So what it ended up looking at was this thing called Yakety. And I may change the name, I don't know yet. But right now it stands for Yet Another Kubernetes Installer Thingy. And this is exactly what it is. It's a program to deploy a single node cluster, multi-node cluster, or multi-master Kubernetes cluster. Here's a brief description of how it works. You can stand up 2 instances in Amazon and just run these 2 commands on these 2 instances. These instances don't know each other at all. They're not aware of each other. They could be in completely different networks, and they will still find each other. And it's all through the magic of the public discovery service from etcd. I'll give a quick example of it here. So I am going to do, where did I have this? Right here. Okay, so I'm going to deploy something called CI latest, which is where is my, you'll notice it's not already over here. Right now we've got Kubernetes clusters running at version 1.11.2 and stable, which may be the same version actually. This make file is just a helper that I run. Oh, well, that's not Yakety. So this is Yakety. This is just run on existing Linux instances. Linux must already be there. It is not responsible for standing up any infrastructure at all, just the Kubernetes cluster. VK8 conformance is a little different. It still uses Terraform to stand up a Kubernetes, stand up virtual machines on a vSphere environment, in a vSphere environment, and uses Yakety to actually install the cluster. It's a little misleading to call this VK8 conformance because it looks like it has something to do with Kubernetes conformance testing, and that is sort of the purpose, except Yakety itself is responsible for the testing. To show you real quick, conformance. If this is set to true, when you run Yakety, the first worker node it finds, it actually installs a service called kubeconformance and then runs the conformance test for the version of the Kubernetes cluster that you just deployed. So technically, you don't need this to run the conformance test. This just stands up the infrastructure. And in fact, the conformance test defaults to false, although maybe it's still on since I'm still developing it. It will default to false, and this is what defaults it to true. So this is just a Docker image that makes it real easy. So Docker run, you give it a configuration file, you give it the image name, and then up. And again, the make file just sort of simplifies things a little further. So you can see what that looks like. No, that's the wrong make file. Docker run, it just takes a couple of additional variables, different options that you can actually find. This is all gets passed to Yakety, the Kubernetes version. So release, CI, whatever. But anyway, I'm going to go ahead and do make up here. And it's going to deploy. Usually takes about 2 minutes, but the network on VMC has been a little slow. It's been slow to provision DHCP leases. By the way, this actually is all possible because of something else I've done recently. GitHub, I don't remember the name of my repo, just so that y'all are aware of it, because I don't know that I've shared it here. VK8, Rexray, show more activity. I don't know, I guess it's been a couple of weeks. Oh, there it is. So I created something called Cloud Init DS VMX Guest Info, and it is a Cloud Init data source for VMware. Basically, it shows you how to use it, but you can use now you can use Cloud Init with any Linux on VMware, and then just pass it the cloud config in the guest info. CoreOS supports it, Photon supports it already, but I wanted Cloud Init to work, or I wanted to deploy Kubernetes to a non-opinionated distribution, because the opinionated distributions made it hard to build from scratch. Okay, so it took what, I don't know, I forgot to run time on it. It was pretty quick. Oh, after about a minute. So we're gonna actually SSH into one of the control plane nodes, sudo journal control. It will still actually be coming up, most likely. Yeah, so it's still, oh, you know what, I should do this, I should follow it. Oh, dang it, this is happening again. Yakety command not found. We're having problems on VMC today where the network is not, it says waiting for network, it's done, but now it says yum can't contact the mirrors. This is so frustrating because I want to do a nice demo, but it's not particular to this, it's just the stupid, did I remove that? I had something in here for this. Let me do this and then I'll rerun it. This will always fix it. Yum, update, assume, I gotta do this real quick. Sudo yum. It just is so dang annoying. But I've been doing this now for like 2 days without any, what is the dang? Okay, assume no. I just want to redo the cache. I don't know if they're making changes on, I don't know what they're doing, but it's only been happening this morning. Okay, so I'm just gonna destroy it real quick and then redeploy it. So normally Yakety gets pulled by this, the VK8 conformance from, where is it? Oh, it's in cloud config. GitHub. Oh, you don't see it there. Yeah, normally it gets pulled directly from GitHub master. Otherwise, but if you define Yakety or Yakety file, it will actually pull it from base64 encoded content or a local file. So it makes developing a little easier. So I guess I had removed the hack, but I thought it's gonna make this work. Yeah, that should work. But yeah, I had to add a thing called wait for network. Now, if you know anything about Cloud.init, you know that the run command runs at basically RC5. It's the very last thing that happens well after the network's supposed to be online. So the fact that Yum is telling me it can't access something is really weird. And it only started happening this morning, and I'm not sure why. Anyway, again, it should only take about a minute to come up. While that's actually happening, I can take you to one of the ones that is already deployed. And so let's see, worker stable, and it is 60. Sorry, I was giving somebody access to the hosts. One of the people at the CNCF needed access. You know what, I'm just gonna copy this. That's the wrong host. All right, so this is the one that I put up yesterday. It's the wrong. I'll show you. Actually, I'll show you this first. No, you won't see anything from that. Not interesting. All right, so as soon as the worker node comes up, it starts running the kube conformance service if configured to do so. And you can see that it passed all the tests right there. Those are in var log kube conformance. There's the E2E log. So it's actually a pretty nice way to stand something up relative. So there's 94 relatively quickly. It takes about a minute to stand up and then start running. Let me XEU cloud final. Let's see if it's throwing up now. Connection refuse. This is actually fine. It's trying to connect to the cluster and it can't do that until it's online. So now it's online. So you can actually see what's happening there. It's deploying everything, and then it waits until the control plane is online, and then it sets up the services, it enables the kube conformance service. And then, by the way, so while I'm doing this, I mentioned this works for DHCP. The reason that works, okay, so it's running, it's running all the conformance tests, yay, and that takes about an hour and a half. The conformance tests take about that long to run. So the reason all this works the way it does with DHCP is because of, let me see if this is the one. Even if it's not, it'll still be useful to show. Because it has that public discovery URL, it polls that URL to discover all of the etcd members. And that's too far back in the log, it's been truncated. But it polls it to discover all the members, and then it waits for all of the nodes to show up in that URL's response. And once it does, each node adds their information to a key on the etcd server. And once all those nodes are discovered, because remember, when you run Yakety, you have to give it the total number of nodes in the cluster, controllers and workers. Once it finds them all, one of the controllers, even if you've got 100 controllers, one of the controllers claims a distributed lock and then generates all of the shared assets. And then all the other controllers wait until those are available. They then download the shared assets. So for example, all controllers have the same certificate for the API server. They have the same certificate for the service keys. Each control plane node runs core DNS, not service DNS, but just core DNS on the control plane node. And it's so the worker node is able to do something like host K8 svmware.ci, and says, oh, it actually is resolvable to all the control plane nodes. And that DNS is running, and it also supports reverse. And that DNS server is running on each of the control plane nodes, cat, core DNS, core file, and it uses etcd. So all the workers point to the control plane nodes for DNS, and all the control plane nodes point to themselves and then Google. So that way, you know, makes deploying this multiple times easy. And then DNS, Kube DNS is actually used for service DNS. I was using Core DNS for service DNS as well, but it failed the DNS conformance test, which is interesting because Core DNS claims it's ready. Anyway, so I wanted to show you finally this. I don't know if this was the one. Obtaining distributed lock. Enable. Okay, yeah, so this actually is the one that generates the contents. So once this was up, generating certs for DNS, created symlink, okay, distributed lock process. Okay, so it obtains a distributed lock to generate the shared assets. It notices that it is the first one to do so, then proceeds to generate the shared assets, all the certificates it needs, and then so that's putting, and then 92 is the other one. You will see sudo control fetching shared assets. Okay, generating or fetching shared assets. It says obtaining shared assets already generated on this node, and then it fetches all the assets, blah, 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 stands something up. It also will only stand up one Kube API server at a time. There is currently a bug with the API server, apparently. I don't remember where I put this. Yeah, here's a link to it. It does this within a lock as well to ensure that only one API server comes up. Again, because of some bug with Kubernetes, if you've got multiple masters in the control plane coming up, you get an error about creating classes. A class has already been created, but it's a known issue. Anyway, so those tests will run. It takes about 90 minutes or however long the conformance tests take. And then at the end, you've got the log that you can upload to the test grid. I mean, and then we're going to use this to stand up a public Kubernetes cluster as well. This was only sort of a side effect of me wanting to learn more about it and then build it from scratch. Sort of followed Kelsey's guide a little bit with some changes. I'm going to switch from Containerd to Creo eventually, I think. But I mean, it's pretty deterministic, and the future changes, better documentation. And I think eventually maybe I want to be able to make this work without systemd. There's no reason it should require it. If you want to use systemd, great. Otherwise, you could literally run Yakety on 2 different VMs. Yakety would block and just background the other processes, and then when it, when it SIG-ints, it just tears everything down. There's no reason it couldn't do that. Why something like Yakety? It doesn't care about how the infrastructure is stood up, and it's easily modifiable. I wanted to do a single script because that way you can make any changes you wanted. Also, I use shell check so that I know there are no errors in it, and it's POSIX compliant, so it should run everywhere. And all the documentation is in here, and I encourage people to take a look at it. It's not going to be for everybody, but for our needs, for setting up Kubernetes clusters fast and then starting the test, paired with VK at conformance, I can get the conformance test running on a new cluster in about 2 minutes, which I think.
So how does this compare with, like, did you check out and reject kubeadm, Typhoon, and some of the other things that are out there?
I rejected kubeadm pretty quickly. I talked with Volk, who are the people contracted by the CNCF to do cross-cloud testing. And I asked them, and one of the things that I asked them recently was, what would you do different if you had it to do over again? Because we were doing some similar things. And they said, we might use kubeadm. So I did some research, and they came back and said, no, you wouldn't, or no, you shouldn't. Because kubeadm still requires a ton of infrastructure to be in place. And I'm not talking about platform. I'm talking about the kubelet. All the dependencies. kubeadm really, I mean, one of the first things it says is run apt or yum to install kubelet and these other 5 things. Well, then I'm not learning anything. That's not helping me. That assumes all this is already there. It's using the kubelet to bootstrap Kubernetes. This is why it's called an installer, not a bootstrapper. This is for installing it. And that's why it can be, I think, pretty portable. And looking at other things, I pretty quickly realized that I wanted to do it. I wanted to do it in a way that was back to the basics. because taking any other tool that had opinions wasn't going to help myself or anyone else learn how to do it or learn how it all works together. And this does. It's one of the reasons I didn't use Core DNS or Photon, because getting Containerd to work on Core DNS was a nightmare because it already has it. Using something called Torx and RKT, if you try to start your own Containerd there, it will immediately say, oh, you should use ours. So this was a very like vanilla Kubernetes on vanilla Linux.
I thought that when I first installed my first Kubernetes cluster, I used kubeadm, and I thought it pulled down the kubelet.
It does not. If you go look at the guide today, it says the kubelet must be in place. It says here's how to curl it down and install the service.
Okay.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
Okay.
In fact, Lubomir, who is very, very well versed in all this, he and I got into a rather passionate discussion in a VMware SIG channel once, and then we realized he only thought about installing Kubernetes as if you put the kubelet down first. He didn't realize, or it didn't occur to him, of course he knew it, that you could actually install the API server directly as a service, or just run it outside the kubelet. I guess a lot of people just aren't doing that. And maybe once kubeadm does become sort of the official thing finally, that's all people will ever use. But the fact is some of us prefer configure over containers.
Yeah,
I wanted to know.
There is a statement that it is the official thing, meaning they have a short list of what's considered supported. That's
yes and no. I mean, every conversation you have with people, they'll still say, well, it's, yes and no. So I hear it is, and then you get into some of these SIG calls and they say, well, we don't really consider it final yet. Thanks, Kenny. But even if it's GA stable, I'm not sure what people's thoughts are on it. But anyway, this is specific for testing. And maybe we switch to that later. Like I said, this was also just sort of a learning project for me. So whether anyone else,
the other one that I see
I don't
people
care.
asking questions on, so I know they're trying to use it, is that Kube Spray. And I've definitely seen people over in the Kubernetes Slack asking questions about using that to deploy on vSphere. The last question I remember seeing implied that maybe it's broken, but there are people who got led down that direction by the documentation.
But thank you,
Spray
Hannes.
is mostly used for testing purposes. It was mentioned in the guys. I think some of the people who were involved in that are working on the cluster API also, and that was a comment that was made last week that Kube Spray is mostly used for testing now.
Well, again, one of the primary reasons behind this is to have a single source that you can modify however you want. All those other tools, they're not very mutable, not without writing Go code or this, that, or the other. And this is just a shell script.
So I have a question out of curiosity. You mentioned that you might move to Creo over Containerd. Is there a reason why?
I was just doing some research, and Containerd seems a little heavier than Creo. Creo is made specifically for Kubernetes. And once you no longer use Docker and you don't have the ability to just randomly run things with Docker run, you start to wonder, why do I care about anything but Kubernetes? And so the only reason I didn't was because it requires Scopio for policy management, and that was one more dependency I needed to build. I mean, all of the dependencies in Yakety get downloaded. They don't use yum for anything except I think like by the host command in LSOF. So like I've made sure all these binaries are available for Linux and they're portable. I even compiled in Nginx myself in such a way that it can run in CoreOS without needing the containers. I stripped out everything except for HTTP redirect and SSL proxy. So it's a pretty portable version of the Nginx binary. So yeah, you can put this down on any Linux. I thought about getting one that works on Darwin because it shouldn't be too hard to set up the kubelet to use Docker.
Andrew?
Yes, sir.
I think it's really useful because I've been using kubeadm for a while to stand up my clusters, but as you said, it requires a lot of dependencies and things to get right before. So just to understand right, you were using Terraform in the conformance thingy that you built to stand up the virtual machines and then run Yakety.
So let me share my screen again. Actually, I can show you that. Share what Terraform actually does. What Terraform is actually doing is here in vSphere. Let me move this. It sets guest info user data to this base64 gzip template, blah, blah, blah. If you go look here, this is where I'm building this. All that ultimately is this cloud config file. I create a group called K8 admin. And actually, so I do a lot of quality of life stuff too. When you log into one of these systems, I can do this. Cube can target all. The reason that works is because when you log into one of these systems, I say, if you're root or you belong to the K8 admin group, export kubeconfig, and kubeconfig, the admin kubeconfig, and kubeconfig is actually set to allow the K8 admin group to have read permissions. So like your normal user can just use kubectl as an admin. So little quality of life stuff. But yeah, this is the cloud config. It's very basic. It sets down the Yakety configuration. It runs the script. And again, it either pulls Yakety from GitHub or if you've got a local copy. The networking is all done through a Cloud Init as well. Again, though, because these are actually CentOS images I'm using, I had to write that data source for it, but it's pretty basic. It uses DHCP, but it could easily use static. But the demo I did for our team this week uses, where is it? Just an Amazon instance. Like, I mean, you could just start 2 Amazon instances and do this. You could basically curl bash it. And
I was interested in whether you also create, with the other script, you also bring up the virtual machines based on the image that you're using, or do you assume images sent us like being deployed?
No, so that's one of the things that I talk about here that actually I think it's even in the notes. Yeah, vSphere template, path to cloud init enabled vSphere Linux template. So it's built into V8 conformance here, as I think like I think it's ours. It's one of our templates, or the template I created, template CentOS. I've been meaning to publish this as an OVA. It's a CentOS 7.5 minimal with nothing on it but the VPX data source I wrote.
Cool.
And cloud init. It's pretty small, but then I mean, it's all of it's configurable. So,
cool. So I have a quick question. Having just done a few hands-on labs, what's your idea of the minimal floor you need to host a cluster deployment with this? Like the size of the VMs and in memory and CPU cores?
That's a great question. If you look in here, you're going to get a really skewed answer. Where is it? This data is based on cross cloud. Cross cloud had some from CNCF had some obscenely high resource requirements, and when we pushed them on it, they finally said it had to do with ONAP testing. We're not testing ONAP, so I could probably bring these down. But I did know originally the conformance test was running off the first control plane node, and it was running a lot slower than I wanted. And when I moved it to the first worker node, it ran a lot faster. And the difference is it has twice the amount of memory and twice the number of processors as the controller node. So if nothing else, you might want to have a single node where you intend to schedule the conformance tests. But by the way, in the end, and so I think these could be brought down. It just, I think, will help run the test faster the more.
And suppose there are use cases perhaps where you want to bring up the cluster, but you're not doing it to run conformance tests. You're doing it to run, say, a hands-on workshop.
Sure, and you can modify all that because it's Terraform, right? Any of these input variables are modifiable just with an environment variable. The end goal, and I'm going to be putting together a slide deck on this. The end goal is we're going to have something that looks like this. A publicly accessible Kubernetes cluster hosted by VMware on VMC where people could schedule workloads. The idea is that my image or Hui's image or a merging of the two, whatever, anybody's image could run there. And then if you've been okayed, we might have an encryption key that you encrypt. We encrypt credentials, and that you have to provide, your key to decrypt it. And so now you can access credentials to run things on the control plane, so that essentially just schedule an image on this, public Kubernetes cluster that can then turn up other Kubernetes clusters. Whether that's for conformance testing or for other things, we don't really care.
Andrew, I think that's a great use case for what SAP asked us in one of the calls we had, where they were looking for a VMware testing environment, testbed environment that you could just spin up and turn down. So keep that in mind. It's a great use case.
It's actually was the goal for this quarter, but there was too much work ramp up to getting the conformance testing working, and we just didn't get there. And my goal was to be able to stand up our public infrastructure in a deterministic way, so that we don't really have to care as much about making sure it's up and running as, oh, it's not, let me just destroy it and recreate it, right? And so I needed a way to stand up Kubernetes that was deterministic. Terraform, having just come off of Cross Cloud, I was pretty familiar with it. And okay. And then I had to figure out how to stand up Kubernetes. And so that all led to this. But due to just time constraints, we're going to be using basically a cron job to run the tests initially. Because here's the thing, one difference between the out of tree and the in-tree testing, Hui doing the out of tree and I've been doing the in-tree, Hui's requires the driver of the test to be outside the cluster. Mine is the cluster. That means that with his, you have to kick it off and then monitor it from somewhere. That means some long-running process outside the cluster has to exist, which Travis CI isn't the greatest thing for that for long running. Neither is Prowl necessarily. Mine's async, but you don't really know if it failed, if it worked. You just hope they get uploaded eventually. That's why we want this public cluster that can host a long-running, basically control process that monitors the results of conformance tests, or standing up and turning down other clusters when necessary. So yeah, and I'll next time I'll try to get a deck together for that to talk about when we're closer to doing, or closer for that being available to the community.
Did you ever look at using the cluster API? You have done it with 2 commands.
Last I heard, none of it was available. Right? That was
no. It's you can create a cluster with 2 commands.
That's great. But when we started this, you weren't even on the cluster API, and Hui and I actually did talk about the cluster API at the very beginning, and we decided, eventually we can replace, anything we do with the cluster API, but we weren't going to block ourselves based on the cluster API. We were like a conversation away from telling Clint, who was our manager at VMware, that if we're going to do this, then we need to produce a cluster API implementation first. This is before you joined the team at VMware and started working on that project.
Well, it sounds like we'll schedule a cluster API deployment at a future VMware SIG meeting then.
Well, if it could do it in 2 commands, I want to see it next week.
Yeah, it's
well, the next meeting's up for 2 weeks, but yeah.
Yeah, the only thing right now is that the delete has some problems. I'm trying to fix that right now.
Oh,
so yeah, you couldn't.
Well, that's the thing. Like this works top to bottom.
You're ready for that demo.
Yeah, let me know when it's GA, and I'll use it.
Okay,
we're nearing the end of the hour. Has anybody got any last-minute agenda items? Otherwise, we'll wrap this up and continue on in 2 weeks. Gone. Okay, let's end this meeting, and I'll stop the recording. Thanks, everybody, for attending. If you didn't put your name on that attendees list in the notes document, there's still time. Please do it now. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.